All right. Thank you very much, Prof. Nara. Salam Sejahtera and a very good morning. This morning, we are delighted to have with us um, Dr. Diana, Dr. Lana, Dr. Rob, and also Amanda Almania. They have a very impressive CV, but I think I will save the time so that we can get to know them better during the Q&A session. They will be presenting an interesting paper entitled Co-Creating Digital Media for Language Revitalization, Cultural Resurgence, Building Indigenous Settler Relations, and Digital Literacy Skills Development. So let's hear from them.
Hi, everyone. I guess we'll just introduce ourselves. We had a pre-recording, so.
Tanse, and thank you, Ibarnio, for inviting us to come and present on our topic of adopting digital tools for community engaged research with Indigenous peoples in Treaty 6 territories. And so this presentation is about how we're using technology to connect Indigenous knowledge to a wider audience within our territories, as well within our nation state of Canada. And I'd like to introduce myself as Lana Whiskey Jack from Saddle Lake Cree Nation. As I am also an assistant professor at the University of Alberta in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. I'm also a visual artist. Thank you. And I'd like to invite Dr. Diana Steinhauer.
That means I shake hands with each one of you in greeting. I'm Diana Steinhauer. I come from Saddle Lake Cree Nation as well. I am currently serving as the president of the Yellowhead Tribal College, which is the only First Nations owned post-secondary institution of higher learning in the city of Edmonton. I will pass it on to Amanda.
Hi, I'm Amanda Almond. I am a recent graduate of the University of Alberta, and I am Métis. And I will pass it on to Dr. McMahon.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rob McMahon. I'm a non-Indigenous scholar, a settler scholar at the University of Alberta. So my area is media and technology. And I'm in the Department of Political Science, where I work as an assistant or associate professor.
This map situates us in the territory we know as Treaty 6 territory in current day Edmonton, Alberta, the province of Alberta, which is a province of the state of Canada. And if you look at the map, we're pretty much in the center, in the heart of the Plains region. And Treaty 6, I'll talk about in the next slide. Our ancestors entered into a treaty relationship with the Crown of Great Britain back in 1876, which permitted settlement on our lands. We agreed to share the lands with the Crown's people who came over as settlers and immigrants. Based on this petroglyph, the lines and the dots are actually depicting a petroglyph that is located in our territory, and our treaty territories. There were more than one treaty. There are actually 11 numbered treaties within the main area of the Plains regions into the territories. And the treaties allowed for settlement and immigration. And the two roads depict our relationship, that we would continue to govern our nations and tribes based on our relationship to the lands and to creation in general, and that the Crown would come and set up their governments. And the idea is that we would live side by side with without interference with one another's jurisdictions in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect.
So as somebody working at a university in more of that Western institutional setting, I learned a lot from Dr. Steinhauer, Dr. Whiskey Jack, and others about how to work in with communities in a way that really respects that treaty relationship and try to design projects where we work together in ways that support those principles of peace, friendship, respect, and non-interference. So within this slide, we can see here that on the left, there's the Western worldview of things like agendas, time, schedules, very much that Western institutional setting that we work with at the university. And then on the right, there's the Indigenous worldview that really prioritizes relationships, process, protocol, and so on. But you can see here, there's an overlapping space in the middle. So that so-called ethical space comes from the work of Dr. Willie Ermine, who's at the First Nations University of Canada. And that the important thing to remember with this ethical space is that while it identifies points of interaction that are in that overlapping space, it also recognizes and respects those boundaries between those two worldviews that reflects that principle of non-interference that Diana spoke of earlier. So within projects, whether it's a course or a research project or a community engagement initiative using digital technologies, the goal is to set it up in such a way that it respects these goals.
One of the projects that applied this approach was the augmented reality project that I worked on with Dr. McMahon, Dr. Steinhauer. And this project created augmented reality stories that were located at Treaty 6 marker sculptures depicted here. The marker sculptures were carved by Stuart Steinhauer from Satellite Cree Nation. Through augmented reality, people can hear stories from Diana as a knowledge keeper located on Treaty 6 territory at the marker sculptures. Augmented reality is the overlay of digital information over your real world view or experience. As you can see in the pictures here, the camera on the device also shows other pictures that you can tap to hear the stories. Augmented reality can then tether these stories to a specific location. We need to be careful when we're thinking about what kind of platform we want to share when we're sharing augmented reality stories, as we want to make sure that we are still retaining the ownership of knowledge that's held collectively, as well as being careful about what kind of access the platform is granting to that knowledge. Augmented reality can be an opportunity for Indigenous people to reconnect to cultural knowledge and for education for non-Indigenous people. Digital storytelling is another approach that can educate and reconnect.
As an Indigenous artist, researcher, and educator, it is important to lift the stories of the communities I come from, even within my own Satellite Cree Nation, to share knowledge with those who no longer live on the land or are disconnected from our languages, from our land teachings, as well as from our cultural knowledge. And so digital storytelling are these tools to be able to connect Indigenous knowledge as well as knowledge keepers through visual digital storytelling ways. Stories that are important to spark the curiosity to learn more about Indigenous knowledge for Indigenous relatives, but also for our non-Indigenous relatives. So digital storytelling is a great educational tool to use to introduce a lot of our Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and also our beautiful worldview. I also wanted to acknowledge the importance of working with my elders and knowledge keepers who so generously share their language as well as their stories to lift one another, as well as lifting our Indigenous knowledge and sharing it through digital storytelling platform. Thank you.
The approaches discussed here today are co-creative and focused on the process. For the augmented reality stories, our focus was not on the content of the stories for myself as a student, it was on the process of co-creating the stories.
And that process of co-creating stories also shifts our focus away from technologies themselves to those relationships that get built and sustained and nurtured through that creative activity that we work on together. So a lot of this work involves centering those relationships within the process of co-creation.
And it is through sharing our stories and building, through sharing our stories of building trust with one another, especially when we come from a long history of the colonial histories with Indigenous people. So it is important that we are moving at the speed of trust in order to build and learn new ways, especially through creating digital tools of sharing Indigenous stories and building that that work and those ways of working together.
All of these processes have intricacies in each one of them, and particularly building trust, building relationships, and identifying the outcomes that will result from the co-creation. So in all of the parties that are represented by the university and the parties represented by the Saddle Lake Cree peoples, for instance, are reciprocal outcomes. And each of our parties entered into a meaningful relationship for different purposes. So for my end, I was looking at reaching a wider audience about the treaty markers, the treaty bear marker story, and why it's important to mark territory and why the bear behaves that way to mark its territory. And for people to understand the oral understanding of the treaty. That was my end goal, and I believe it was reached beautifully in this co-creation process. And for the university, they also wanted to use augmented reality and digital storytelling as a means of educating a population of learners to use these digital tools for purposes of learning so that they can develop and be comfortable and confident in using digital tools moving forward.
I really appreciate that, like the relation, the way one another, how we each kind of co-mentored each other through this process as well, and hearing even the stories of the work that went into creating that augmented reality. So I think that's also really important to kind of highlight was that work. And I know the outcome for the work around digital stories was really about like our knowledge keepers wanting to share for the future generations, you know, and we think about our treaty relations being as long as the sun shines, the waters flow, and the grass grows. So we're just continuing that good relations.
And that concludes our presentation. That is translated in from Cree to English as I shake hands with all of you. We are all related. And if you have any questions, we can open the floor now for questions. If you have a desire to get in contact with any one of us, we've identified our email addresses here on this slide. And we also wish to thank our funders who are identified with their logos on the bottom of this slide.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. Now we have some time actually for question and answer. So anyone would like to ask a question? I do have one, but I let the others ask first, and then perhaps yeah.
Can I start, Salva?
Yeah, please.
All right. Well, it was a pleasure listening to you, Rob and Lana. I really feel like you are here with us, right? Glad to meet Dr. Stenha and also Amanda. I mean, it's really interesting words. I mean, that I came across today. Moving at the speed of trust. I think those words ring in my mind. I know this is really what comes also to our minds when we think of our own projects in Sarawak and in the interior areas. So really, I see a connection. I have one question. The question is, how do you decide on the interaction to preserve within this new media? Right? We want it to be natural. We want it to reflect the community. So it's a delicate process. I mean, it's I know how to say it, but I don't know how to do it. So can you explain?
Thank you, Professor Nara. Yeah, wonderful question. It's so good to see our friends from across the world again. So yeah, it's it's a really important question. And I think tying into that idea of moving at the speed of trust and then working with our community team members, right? So Dr. Steinhauer, we don't call her a collaborator or a partner. She's a full member of the team, right? And so as we were working with her to utilize digital technologies like augmented reality to share the treaty stories, we actually came up with a plan within our team where we separated out the boundaries between, sort of the technology side and the process side, and then the Indigenous knowledge side. And as somebody working in that Western institution, and working with students who are engaged in recording Diana's treaty stories, we identified different parts of connection, whereby like we learned from her, like, what would we like to record? What would we like to share? What would be the rules around the access and sharing? And so, of course, it's different in every context and in every project. And we learned a lot along the way. But yeah, that was kind of how it went about in that. So it wasn't so much we had like a series of steps predetermined, but what were these points of interaction and dialogue? And I think that was kind of really, the students really responded well to that, because then that opened up these conversations around things like ownership and control of digital data, or broader questions around settler colonialism and reciprocal relations and that kind of thing. So just kind of learning with one another together in that very slow, measured process, I suppose. Yeah.
Nara, are you?
Yes, Dr. Roger has raised his hand.
Okay. Roger?
Thank you, Salva. Hello, everyone. Great to see you guys from Alberta. I still remember we had such a splendidly inspiring interaction last time in Sarawak. So I'm really happy that we can still build on that connection. And I love your presentation. I mean, I love the work you do. The sentiments behind it resonate with so much that we do. Oftentimes we feel kind of lonely in a global sense, and it's just wonderful to hear that you people are kind of, having the same heartfelt interest in what happens amongst Indigenous peoples where you live. But I want to ask, as an academic, without in any way impugning what you do and the value of it, we call ourselves researchers, and we like to think about, well, what's the impact? Sorry, academic speak. I hate that word. What's the effect? What are the outcome results of the wonderful work that you do? and who is affected by it. I mean, I don't know how you address these questions, but I think it's important to at least try to do that so that you can demonstrate not just the emotional value of what you do, but in a more tangible way to demonstrate why and how this work should continue and even expand and be built into mainstream considerations of development and other practices and policies that affect the people that you work with.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. I thought maybe, Amanda, did you want to speak to some of your work on this? And then I could speak from the University of Alberta side, but did you want to talk about some of the impact of the way that you approach your augmented reality work?
For me, the impact was really on the community side, both as a chance for Indigenous people to reconnect to the stories. And for myself, I'm a descendant of someone who signed Treaty 6, which was the agreement to share the land between the Crown and the Indigenous people in the area. But I hadn't heard the treaty story till Diana shared it. And recognizing that this was an important story that needed to be shared more is part of the reason that I worked on this project and was involved in it. And just hearing from people when they hear the stories, wanting to move towards a better understanding of what the treaties were about and what the impact of settler colonialism on that way. So it really is about planting a seed in people to help them learn.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I'll speak a little bit as somebody working in a university too. So I'll talk about two things. One was a course that was developed through this that aimed to integrate sort of a digital media course with this process of Indigenous settler relations. So how can we work in a way that creates something, like work together to produce something, but then use that process of co-production or co-creation as a way to have difficult conversations around issues related to settler colonialism or, sort of critical approaches to technology. So finding a way to integrate that within a graduate program on communications and technology. And then within the academic frame, we did get a publication out of this, but it was, we were very conscious about those boundaries I spoke about, where we weren't writing about any of the Indigenous knowledge aspect of it, but it was rather framed as an article about the process of co-creation that we went through, and then drawing on that and kind of telling that story. So it was more of like a narrative type of article, but we were happy to get that published in that sense. But it's still very much like local and grounded within the community. So we would love to learn from our colleagues here too, like how are you doing this kind of work and demonstrating that too in other contexts and other ways. So yeah, your questions really got me thinking, Professor Nar and Dr. Roger, so thank you.
Thank you for that response. Does anyone have any questions? Can I ask a question, Prof. Nara? Am I allowed as the moderator? Thank you so much, Prof. Nara. I have a question because I also have collected some stories from the Barrio community. And I do agree with you that the value of stories in imparting knowledge, preserving and also imparting knowledge. Yeah, I'm wondering whether in your work, in the stories that you have collected, I'm sure you have collected many stories. Were there any stories that were considered by the community they wouldn't want it to be shared with the larger community? Were there any selection criteria in digitalizing the stories collected from the community?
Amanda, did you want to speak to this one?
I can touch on it briefly, is that with Indigenous governance systems, there's ways of having permission to share stories and where you can share them. There was one story we initially considered sharing through augmented reality, but ultimately we did not have permission to share it in a picture form, and we wanted some visuals to go along with it. So we did not share that story. There could be ways with augmented reality to share a story. One of the things, like, you know, some stories are only told in the winter when there's snow on the ground, and you would be able to turn the story on and off with the technology of it. But really we're guided by the community and who our audience is. And for this project, because the stories were shared publicly, we followed Indigenous governance. Dr. Diana Steinhauer, as a knowledge keeper, has permissions and holds stories for future generations. And she was able to tell us which ones that we could share.
And just one thing to add on the technology side is that we also thought about what were the characteristics of the digital platforms we were using. So Amanda did an excellent evaluation of different augmented reality platforms. It turned out the perfect one we found initially, which was all geared towards open access and education for nonprofit purposes, was bought up by a different company and then we and discontinued. So we evaluated some other ones with a lot of care and attention with respect to how, like, where is the digital data housed? And then are you inadvertently giving away your copyright privileges or something? So Diana guided us through that. And then we kind of tried to look at some of the terms and conditions of the platforms we were using on the tech side as well.
Thank you so much for the explanation. Yeah, thank you. Any other question? Do we still have about a minute plus? Anyone has any burning questions? All right. Sorry?
I do see a question in the chat.
Okay. Let's look at the chat. Yeah. Would you like to address that question?
I can address it a little bit. Yeah, we're taking something that, you know, who tells the story is a big part of the story. So you might hear a story different ways from different people, and by digitizing it, we are making it rather static, as you notice. These stories are really meant to be an introduction in some ways for people, especially as Indigenous settler relationships, for someone to hear the story. And in one of the first stories, Diana explains how to offer protocol. So if you want to speak to an elder and hear more stories, you can do so in a respectful way. So again, they're kind of a starting place and an introduction of how to do that, in the hopes that this would be planting a seed for further engagement with elders and with community members. We worked with one community, Saddle Lake Cree Nation. So that way we were guided by to people, as I'm just addressing the question, any frictions between communities. We know that different stories are told different ways, and there's different teachings and things like that. But for this project, we were working with one community specifically. But yeah, it's meant, there's, you know, with technology, it doesn't replace the teachings we receive from our elders and knowledge keepers. This is meant to be a place to get people, to invite them to be curious, as Diana says, and learn more.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing the interesting research with us. It's truly a good learning experience for all of us, and I hope that we can collaborate further. So time is up. It's 9:30. I hand over to the next moderator. I have a class to attend. I'll see you. All the best.